It was a cold, black night off Charleston, South Carolina on February 17, 1864. Out on the water, the Union warship USS Housatonic, pronounced Housatonic, sat at anchor as part of the blockade. The sea was calm. The sky was sharp with stars. Most of the crew expected another routine night. Then a lookout saw something that did not belong, not a sail, not a steamer, something low, dark, and moving straight toward the ship. Rifles cracked in the darkness. Men shouted, the anchor crew scrambled to get way on, but the strange shape kept coming, and then a blast erupted along the Housatonic's side. In less than 5 minutes, a proud American warship slipped beneath the water and the attacker vanished. The weapon that struck that blow was not a cannon, not an ironclad, not even a mine. It was a hand-cranked submarine built in desperation, crewed by volunteers, and remembered as the CSS Hunley. Welcome, friends. I'm glad you're here. If you're the kind of person who loves the old stories of courage, ingenuity, and sacrifice, you're in the right place. And if you enjoy these Civil War narratives, consider subscribing to join our community of history lovers. We keep these memories alive because they still matter. Now you might be wondering, why does the Hunley matter? Because the Hunley changed warfare forever. Long before modern submarines prowled the oceans, 8 men climbed into a narrow iron tube so tight they could barely shift their shoulders. They had no engine, no modern air supply, no quick escape. Just iron water pressure, darkness, and a single crankshaft they had to turn by hand. They knew one mistake meant drowning in silence, and they went anyway. Tonight, we're going to walk through the Hunley story from beginning to end. We'll talk about the blockade that squeezed Charleston. We'll meet the inventors and the volunteers. We'll relive the night the Hunley struck the Housatonic, and we'll follow the mystery all the way to the modern discovery of the submarine on the sea floor. It is a story of American ingenuity and a story of American loss. Background and context: Charleston, the blockade, and desperation. Now, to understand what happens next, we need to step back and picture Charleston as it was in the middle years of the war. Charleston was not just a southern city, it was a symbol. Fort Sumter sat in the harbor, and it was there in April of 1861 that the first shots of the Civil War were fired. From the very beginning, Charleston carried the weight of the conflict. By 1863 and 1864, Charleston also sat under the hard pressure of the Union blockade. Union ships patrolled the approaches to the harbor, trying to stop supplies from reaching the Confederacy. That blockade was not perfect, but it was relentless, and the blockade mattered. It meant fewer medicines, fewer boots, fewer tools, less salt, less coffee, less flour. It meant hunger and shortages creeping deeper into southern towns. It also meant the Confederate government and military leaders were willing to try bold, risky ideas to break the Union grip. On the Union side, blockade duty was dangerous too. Storms could wreck ships, disease spreads fast, shore batteries could open up without warning, and every sailor anchored off Charleston knew he was sitting in enemy waters, within reach of whatever new contraption the Confederates might attempt. In the language of the day, the Confederates talked often about torpedoes. That word meant explosives placed in the water, what we would call naval mines today, and those mines did sink ships, but Confederate leaders wanted something even more unsettling: a weapon that could move quietly, strike a ship where it felt safe, and disappear into the dark. That idea led to one of the most daring machines of the 19th century, a submarine. Main narrative: Chapter 1. The men who built an iron coffin. The Hunley did not appear out of thin air. It came from a string of experiments, dangerous, uncertain, and remarkably inventive for their time. In Mobile, Alabama, a group of men worked on underwater boats. Among the names tied closely to the project were Horace Lawson Hunley, James McClintock, and Baxter Watson. They were not dreaming in a peaceful laboratory. They were building in a nation at war, with resources running low. Their early attempts included primitive submarines such as the Pioneer and the American Diver. Those craft revealed the same hard truth again and again. It was incredibly difficult to control a vessel underwater. It was difficult to see, difficult to breathe, difficult to steer. A small mistake could become a fatal one, but the idea would not die. Eventually, a new craft was built, what we now call the H.L. Hunley, named after Horace Hunley himself. Friends, try to picture it. About 40 feet long, made of iron, shaped like a narrow cylinder. Two small hatches, one forward, one aft, tiny glass viewports, ballast tanks to take on water and dive, hand pumps to remove water and rise. Inside, 8 men sat on a bench, shoulder to shoulder. Down the center ran a crankshaft connected to a propeller. Each man turned a handle to push the submarine forward. No engine, no steam, no coal, no quiet comfort of machinery, just muscle. And at the bow was the weapon, the spar torpedo. That was a black powder charge mounted on the end of a long pole like a lance. The plan was terrifyingly direct. The Hunley would approach an enemy ship, ram the spar into the hull, attach the charge, back away, and then detonate it with a line. Can you imagine volunteering for that job, getting close enough to strike and then trusting that you could back away in time? Even by the standards of Civil War courage, it was an extraordinary risk. And there was another enemy inside the Hunley, just as deadly as Union rifles. The crew's oxygen supply was limited. Accounts from the era describe the use of a candle as a crude warning when the flame weakened or went out. The air was becoming dangerous. Every breath mattered, every minute counted. It was not a ship. It was an iron coffin, and many men knew it. Chapter 2, The First Sinkings and the Price of Experiments. The Hunley was moved to Charleston, where Confederate defenders hoped it could strike the blockade. But before it ever sank an enemy ship, it sank itself. During early training runs in Charleston Harbor in the late summer of 1863, the Hunley suffered its first fatal accident. In one widely reported account, the submarine was at the surface when something went wrong, possibly a mistake with diving controls. Water poured in through an open hatch and the Hunley went down. Several men drowned, the submarine was raised, it was repaired, and once again the Confederates tried to make it work. Then came the second tragedy, the one that sealed the Hunley's reputation. On October 15, 1863, the Hunley was conducting another test. This time Horace Hunley himself was aboard. Whether he felt responsible or whether he believed his presence would steady the operation, we cannot know for certain. But we do know the outcome. The Hunley sank again. All 8 men aboard died, including Hunley. Just imagine the darkness inside that hull, iron all around, water rising, frantic hands searching for valves and pumps, a struggle for air, and then silence. After 2 fatal sinkings, any reasonable person might have ended the experiment, but war makes reasonable people do unreasonable things. Charleston was still under blockade. The Confederate defenders were still desperate. So the Hunley was raised yet again, cleaned, repaired, and prepared for combat. And then came the most remarkable fact of all. Men volunteered to crew it. They knew it had killed others, and they climbed inside anyway. That choice tells us something important about the men of that era. Whether they wore blue or gray, many believed deeply in duty. Many believed that sacrifice was honorable. Many believed that God's providence ruled their lives and that if they were meant to live, they would live. One of those volunteers became the heart of the Hunley's final crew, Lieutenant George E. Dixon. Chapter 3, George Dixon, a gold coin and 8 volunteers. George Dixon was associated with the 21st Alabama Infantry. He was a soldier, not a famous inventor, and like so many soldiers, he carried a small piece of home with him. A gold coin. Tradition says the coin was given to him by a young woman before he went to war, a keepsake meant to protect him. And the story goes that at Shiloh on April 6, 1862, a bullet struck Dixon in the thigh. And the coin in his pocket took the force of the impact. The coin was dented and Dixon survived. Over time, the coin became part of the Hunley's legend because it reminds us that war is not just iron and gunpowder. It is personal, it is love letters, it is keepsakes, it is parents praying by lamplight. The Hunley's crew, 8 men, came from different walks of life. Some were soldiers, some were sailors, some were mechanics. Some were immigrants who had come to America seeking a future and found themselves in a civil war instead. When historians later identified the crew, the names included George Dixon, James A. Wicks, Frank Collins, Joseph Ridgway, Arnold Becker, C. F. Carlson, Augustus Miller, and Joseph F. Gibbons. 8 human beings, 8 families, 8 sets of hands that had to turn that crank in perfect rhythm. They trained in Charleston Harbor. They practiced trimming the boat, balancing the ballast, navigating with almost no visibility. They learned how to communicate with the surface and how to signal their return. One reported method involved a blue light shown after a successful mission, letting Confederate observers know the Hunley was coming back in. You can almost hear the training in your mind, the creak of iron, the scrape of boots, the steady, tiring rhythm of the crank, men breathing shallowly in stale air, trying not to panic. And on the other side, out in the dark Atlantic swells, Union sailors kept watch aboard the blockading ships. One of those ships was the USS Housatonic. Captain Charles W. Pickering commanded her, and like many officers and men on blockade duty, his crew lived with routine, watches, meals, maintenance, a quiet confidence that the danger was mostly above the surface. But the Hunley's whole purpose was to prove that danger could come from below. Chapter 4, The Attack on the Housatonic. Now we return to that cold night, February 17, 1864. The Housatonic was anchored outside Charleston Harbor, part of the blockade line. Around 8:45 in the evening, according to Union reports, the lookout saw something in the water moving toward the ship. Some accounts describe it as looking like a plank or a log, something low and strange, cutting through the sea. At first, it did not seem possible, a boat without a visible hull. Without sails, without steam, but it kept coming. The crew reacted quickly, rifles fired into the darkness. Orders were shouted, men rushed to get the ship moving. But an anchored vessel cannot leap forward. It needs time to lift anchor and gather speed, and in those minutes the distance closed. The Hunley pressed in. The spar torpedo struck the side of the Housatonic near the waterline, and then the explosion. The blast ripped open the ship's side and water poured in. The Housatonic sank rapidly within about 5 minutes. 5 Union sailors died that night. Many others survived because the ship went down in relatively shallow water, leaving portions above the surface. Men clung to rigging. Some climbed high, shivering, calling out to nearby ships. Rescue boats came quickly, guided by sound and lantern light. When we tell this story, we should remember those Union sailors as more than names on a report. They were Americans too, working men and farm boys and sons of immigrants. Men who wrote home, men who prayed, men who served because they believed the Union mattered. And on the Confederate side, the Hunley had achieved the impossible. It became the first submarine in history to sink an enemy warship in combat. For the Confederacy, it was a triumph of invention and daring. For the Union Navy, it was a shock, a warning that the sea was becoming a new kind of battlefield. But the Hunley's story does not end with victory. It ends with a mystery, because after the explosion, the Hunley vanished. Some Confederate observers later reported seeing a signal light out on the water, suggesting the submarine survived the attack and tried to return, but it never reached shore. No one saw it come in. No crew climbed out, no hero's welcome took place, just silence and unanswered questions. Did the submarine flood? Did it become tangled? Was the crew overcome by lack of air? Was the Hunley damaged by its own blast? For more than a century, America did not know. And the sea kept the Hunley and its 8 men in the dark. Legacy and reflection, a mystery raised from the deep decades past. The Civil War ended. The nation reunited, scarred but unbroken. Charleston rebuilt, the harbor changed, but the Hunley remained out there somewhere. Then in the late 20th century, search teams began looking in earnest. In 1995, the Hunley was found on the seabed off Charleston, resting quietly, largely intact, like a time capsule sealed in sand and salt. When researchers examined the submarine more carefully, they saw something haunting. The crew appeared to be at their stations, not scattered, not piled near the hatches, at their places as if the end came swiftly, leaving little time for chaos. In August of 2000, the Hunley was raised from the ocean floor and brought to a conservation facility. It was a moment that felt like history taking a breath, like the past finally resurfacing. And then came one of the most moving chapters of all. In April of 2004, the Hunley's crew received a proper burial in Charleston with military honors. Thousands gathered, flags were present, drums sounded, men in period uniforms walked slowly behind the coffins. Clergy offered prayers, families and strangers alike stood with solemn faces. However we interpret the politics of that era, those 8 men were still human beings and Americans, and their families had waited a very long time for that dignity. During the investigation and recovery, George Dixon's famous coin was found as well dented and preserved. It even bore an inscription that reflected its meaning to him, a private testimony from one soldier's life. Modern science has continued to ask the hardest question of all. What killed the Hunley's crew? One leading explanation is that the torpedo blast created a powerful shock wave through the water and the iron hull, possibly injuring or incapacitating the men instantly, leaving no time to surface. Others have suggested issues with air currents, mechanical failure, or flooding. The truth is, we may never know every detail with complete certainty, but we know enough to understand the larger point. The Hunley was both a breakthrough and a tragedy. It proved the concept of submarine warfare, and it demanded an almost unimaginable sacrifice from the men inside. And as we reflect, it is worth holding both sides of that night in our minds. The Union sailors of the Housatonic attacked without warning in the dark, doing their duty. And Dixon and his crew climbing into a machine that had already killed others, believing their mission mattered, blue or gray. They were all Americans caught in a terrible war between Americans. Let's return one last time to that black water off Charleston. A strange shape moving through the night. A shouted warning on a Union deck, rifle shots cracking over the sea, then an explosion and silence. The Hunley reminds us that human ingenuity can change warfare in an instant, but it also reminds us that every invention has a human cost, and that cost is often paid by young men who believe duty is worth any risk. We can honor the sailors of the Housatonic and the crew of the Hunley at the same time, because the Civil War was a family tragedy as much as it was a military conflict. If this story moved you, please share it with a fellow history lover, and leave a comment telling us which Civil War story should we explore next. Thank you for spending this time with me, friends. Until next time, keep their memory alive.